This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 554 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Week 3 was a pretty good one for the Sleeper Show. While I was wrong about Justin Fields, although I guess I was kind of right because I talked about his volatility, I was right to point out both Emmanuel Sanders and AJ Green, who were both top 24 wide receivers. And then given the types of plays that I'm talking about on this show, a lot of players were fine. Jalen Reagor had 8 targets, so the process was there for him. Cordero Patterson was a top 20 back. Daniel Jones and Derek Carr were reasonable enough streamers. And then the players to consider benching, that was good too. Brandon Ayuk was finally able to do something for fantasy managers, but Myles Gaskin, Ronald Jones, Damian Harris, and Corey Davis all ended up being pretty mediocre to bad plays. Not everything was perfect. Some picks weren't good, but overall it was a solid week. Before getting to sleepers for week 4, did you know that FanDuel is giving new users an exclusive offer to play NFL Daily Fantasy for free all season long? All you have to do is sign up for FanDuel Daily Fantasy, and you'll receive 1 free voucher for each remaining week of the NFL season. You'll receive your voucher upon sign up to FanDuel Daily Fantasy, and vouchers will automatically apply to each weekly entry. Head over to FanDuel.com and sign up to play Daily Fantasy Football. Eligibility restrictions apply, new users only. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. I've got to admit, this show is getting harder and harder with the percent roster numbers normalizing a little bit. I'm doing my best to stay within the completely arbitrary parameters that I set at the beginning of the season, though. And speaking of arbitrary parameters, let's start with players who are rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues, but more than 24% of them. Streaming is kind of tough at quarterback this week, but I think Sam Darnold can work. Darnold scored just 4 fewer points than Russell Wilson this year in standard scoring leagues. But we've got to keep in mind that he's averaging a rushing touchdown per game. He's not going to finish the season with 17 rushing touchdowns. The good news is that because he's scoring on the ground, he's not scoring through the air, and his touchdown rate is under 3% as a result. So we could see that bump up while his rushing touchdowns drop. Dallas isn't the best matchup in the world on paper. Through 3 games, they've actually been the 5th toughest matchup when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. But this game has a pretty good over-under according to FanDuel Sportsbook, and this could end up being the first game where the Panthers have to actually air it out. That could skew their touchdown totals towards the pass, benefiting Darnold. Now, I don't absolutely love Darnold this week, but it's a rough week for quarterback streamers in general. Next up is a pair of Buffalo Bills that I talked about as ads on the 15 Transactions show earlier this week. Emmanuel Sanders consistently makes this episode because his percent roster numbers just aren't going up the way they should. I'll just reiterate some of the things that I said earlier this week. He's been the deep ball threat for Buffalo, and he has one of the highest average depth of targets in the league. 7 of his 20 targets have gone 15 or more air yards. He's seen 16.5% of Buffalo's targets. And now he gets a Houston team that's seen the second highest percentage of pass attempts against them go 15 or more air yards. You have to love Josh Allen and that passing attack in this game. And that includes the other Buffalo Bill, Dawson Knox. Like I said on the 15 Transactions episode, Knox has run more routes than Cole Beasley over the last 2 weeks. He's run just 5 fewer routes than Stephon Diggs. Now the Bills have an implied team total of almost 32 points. You don't get that very often. I just want pieces of this offense this week because they should roll. On this show, the only running backs that I can really talk about starting are pass catching backs because all other running backs are rostered at a pretty high rate. So I'm going to go back to Kenneth Gainwell as a flex option this week. Do I absolutely adore Gainwell? No, it's kind of hard to considering he's been the RB22, 38, and 42 through 3 weeks. But he's seen about an 11% target share this season in that Philly offense, and he acts as the hurry-up back. Considering the Eagles get the Chiefs this week in a game where they're 7-point home underdogs, that role could be busy. And then the last player in this tier that I don't mind is Nelson Agholor. Jacoby Myers is the Patriots wide receiver that you should prefer, but Agholor is rostered in a lot fewer leagues, so he's getting a shout out today. On the season, Agholor's run the second most routes among all Patriots by a decent margin, and he's seen a little over 15% of their targets. He's not someone I'd really care about for fantasy most weeks, but I'm intrigued by the matchup against Tampa Bay. The Bucs have been a defense that's great against the run, and they struggle against the pass. That's been evident already in 2021. They're top 7 in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they've been the best team for quarterbacks and the best team for wide receivers. Aguilar hasn't been used the same way that Jakobi Meyers has. Meyers has 11 more targets this year, but Aguilar has more air yards, and the Patriots may have to air it out against Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay's faced the most pass attempts this year by far. The average team has faced 35 pass attempts per game. Tampa Bay is at 48. We may not get a ton of opportunities where the Patriots throw at a high rate, so Aguilar makes some sense as a sleeper this week. I've got 4 players in this next tier of players, which are players rostered in 10 to 24% of leagues. And then I got an extra one in the next tier. But let's start with something that I talked about last week, and that's Jalen Reagor. As I just mentioned, the Eagles are underdogs this week. That could force more throws. That's similar to what we saw in week 3. Jalen Hurts had 39 pass attempts last week. Jalen Reagor saw 8 targets against Dallas and now has a 20.4% target share this season. Against the team that's been 7th worst against wide receivers this year when adjusted for strength of opponent, Reagor's not a terrible play. I also kind of don't mind Terrace Marshall this week. I talked about Darnold already and this higher scoring game that we might see. And Marshall has a shot to be part of that. Not only is Christian McCaffrey out, which could change the way that Carolina operates, but in week 3, Marshall saw his usage get a lot closer to Robbie Anderson. In week 1, Marshall was about 30 percentage points lower in snap share compared to Anderson. In week 2, 22 percentage points. Last week, less than 3 percentage points. That's reflected in routes run and target share too. According to Pro Football Focus, Anderson ran 33 routes in week 1 to Marshall's 23. In week 2, 35 to 24. In week 3, 31 to 26. On the season, Marshall's seen 14% of Carolina's targets. Anderson is at 11%. If we see Marshall in more 2 wide receiver sets, that's just going to increase his production each week. And again, we're playing into the idea here that this could be Carolina's first real negative game script, or even neutral game script. They've generally just been playing with a lead. That's not guaranteed against Dallas. With Marshall seeing that uptick last week with no CMC, and with Marshall leading that receiving group in red zone targets so far this year, maybe this is the week that it all comes together. Dalton Schultz actually has had similar usage to Blake Jarwin this year. He's only run 3 more routes, but his target share is almost 4 percentage points higher, and he's just looked good. He had a monster game in week 3, and he's got a chance to continue that work into week 4. Carolina's tight end points allowed numbers look bad on paper. They rank 5th best in points allowed to the position. But when adjusting that for opponent, they're just an average matchup. I think given Schultz's recent performance, he's got to be on your radar. And then finally, I'm going to go back to AJ Green. It's not easy finding a low rostered player who's got an 18% target share in one of the best offenses in the league. Period. And the Cardinals should see a lot of passing volume in their matchup against the Rams this week. They're 4.5 point underdogs in the game with a 55 point over under. It's one of those games that you just want exposure to. Let's talk deep sleepers or players who are rostered in under 10% of Yahoo leagues who you may be able to work into your starting lineups this week. First off, Taylor Heineke. The football team gets Atlanta this week, and it's in a game that's projected to be close with a 48.5 point over under. The Falcons have been totally average in adjusted fantasy points allowed this year to quarterbacks. And they entered the season with one of the worst secondaries. So I'm not worried about the matchup. Heineke himself is coming off back-to-back top 12 quarterback performances. And one thing that he's doing that's not getting talked about that much is that he's running the football. He had 8 carries last week, and one of those carries went for a touchdown. During a week where streaming is tough, I think that he could give you strong enough QB2 numbers to not sink your team. Here's one that's going to surprise you. Kadarius Toney. Yes, Kadarius Toney. Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton are both banged up. If Sterling Shepard is out, I would expect Kadarius Toney to see a lot of slot work in the Giants offense. Shepard's played 74% of his snaps from the slot this year. And even though Toney's action has been limited, he's second on the team with a 62% slot rate. It was 82% last week, which was the game where Shepard got hurt. If Shepard's out, Toney actually has a decent slot matchup against the Saints. New Orleans so far this year ranks 2nd in percent of targets that have gone to that area of the field. And they're 1st in slot targets allowed overall and 2nd in slot receptions allowed. That makes Kadarius Toney kind of intriguing. Van Jefferson's peripherals continue to be there. He's still leading Robert Woods in the routes run department on the year, and he ran just 5 fewer routes than Woods last week. Van also had a 16% target share last week. That boosted his season-long share to about 13%. You may not feel great starting him most weeks. I totally get it. But at least this week, he's in a potential shootout against the Cardinals. So like AJ Green, he's a cheap way to get exposure to that game. And then the last player in this tier that I want to talk about today is Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. AJ Brown and Julio Jones are both banged up. That's going to give or potentially give other pass catchers in that offense a chance to step up. Westbrook-Ikhine is the one who probably benefits most from these injuries. Chester Rogers is the team's slot guy. He's played 84% of his snaps from the slot this year. That's probably why we saw Westbrook-Ikhine run more routes than Rogers last week, with AJ Brown exiting early. He's also the one with size in this offense, aside from Julio Jones and AJ Brown, of course. But Westbrook-Ikhine is 6'3", 216 pounds. So there's some intrigue here. I think he makes sense as a sleeper as long as both Julio Jones and AJ Brown are out. If just one of them are out, the appeal isn't as strong, but it's still there because he should find the field quite a bit. A lot of people have asked me about Laviska Shenault and what to do with him. And the answer is you can't start him. He's got a 17.5% target share on the season, and he has yet to finish higher than wide receiver 42 in weekly PPR scoring. That's partially because of how he's being used. A lot of it is because of how he's being used. Among 76 relevant wide receivers this year, he has the 5th lowest average depth of target. He's a borderline drop candidate in 10 to 12 team leagues. The Raiders' passing attack is tough to trust this week too. I talked about this on the 10 Trends episode yesterday, but the Chargers have been really good against the pass this year. Despite facing Dak Prescott and Patrick Mahomes and the weapons that those teams have, the Chargers are 7th best in passing yards allowed, and they rank 1st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, 2nd to wide receivers, and 5th to tight ends. I like the Raiders' passing attack moving forward, but temper expectations in week 4. I've got 2 running backs who are rostered in 75% or more of leagues that you could consider benching here in week 4. The first one's kind of obvious, it's Damian Harris. The Buccaneers have been tough on running backs dating back to the last couple of seasons, and Harris has been a one-dimensional running back. Maybe the James White injury opens things up for him, but considering they were using Brandon Bolden last week, and considering it was reported that Harris couldn't be trusted in a pass blocking role, I'm not sure his target share is going to skyrocket. He's got a 5% share this season, and I think that's what we have to project for him moving forward. He's tough to trust against Tampa Bay. And then let's talk about Ty'Son Williams. Here's the good news about Williams' disappearing act in week 3. He played 50% of the team's snaps. That was most among all Ravens running backs and right in line with weeks 1 and 2. And he was the only Baltimore running back to see a target. Here's the bad news. Latavius Murray still saw more touches, and that target share was still pretty bad. I think Williams is still the 1A in that backfield. He's still the one that I would want most. But this is honestly the Ravens' backfield in a nutshell. It's a headache. It's going to be a headache. Ty'Son will have some decent days, but it's not going to be easy to predict. And it makes it even harder when they've got a tough matchup against Denver this weekend. Now let's talk about streaming defenses before we go. I talked up the Titans on the 15 Transactions episode as a streaming defense this week. They're now rostered in like 60% of Yahoo leagues. So let's move on to a few other options in week 4. First is Chicago. The Bears get the Lions at home in a game with a really low 42-point over-under. Chicago's actually not been bad defensively this year. I know week 1 was a little rough, but they also faced the Rams. They've been defense 2-13 over the last 2 weeks with 9 total sacks. Detroit's been a top 5 team to attack in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed, so I think Chicago works. I also like Cincinnati on Thursday night against Jacksonville for obvious reasons. But Jacksonville's been a fringe top 5 team for team defenses in fantasy. The Bengals are at home, they're big favorites, and they also haven't been that bad defensively to start the year. So I like the Bengals quite a bit. And then Miami works this week too. They're home favorites. The over-under in that game against Indianapolis is 42.5, so that's all good. And according to Next Gen Stats, Miami has been setting the blitz at the highest rate in the league. Carson Wentz has been below average in passer rating under pressure to start the year. The Colts have allowed almost 3 sacks per game to start the season to go along with 2 top 12 performances to opposing defenses. So I think the Dolphins work. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. We got one more show this week, the mailbag episode. I'll talk to you then.